They burned down Obese Girl's only home. Mountain Man showed them what real fire looks like. The Wyoming wind carried dust and desperation in equal measure through the nameless settlement folks called Bitter Creek. It was 1824, and civilization had barely scratched the surface of this brutal land. The town consisted of a trading post, a saloon that doubled as an inn, a blacksmith's forge, and a scattering of crude structures that optimistic men called homes. Beyond the last weathered building stretched endless prairie, broken only by the jagged teeth of mountains that bit into the western sky. Martha Brennan knew every rotted plank of the wagon wheel inn. At 19, she had spent 3 years scrubbing floors, hauling water, and emptying chamber pots in exchange for stale bread and a corner near the stables where the horses at least provided warmth. Her body was heavy, her clothes threadbare and patched, her hands raw from lye soap and cold water. The innkeeper, a weasel-faced man named Cullen, paid her nothing but scraps and allowed the patrons to treat her worse than the livestock. "Move your fat ass, hog girl!" someone would shout when she carried dishes too slowly. She learned to keep her eyes down, to make herself small despite her size, to disappear into the walls even as she stood in plain sight. The women of Bitter Creek ignored her. The men treated her as a joke, something less than human. Children threw pebbles and ran away laughing. But Martha endured. She had nowhere else to go. Her parents had died of fever when she was 16, leaving her with nothing but the clothes she wore. In this harsh land, a young woman alone faced choices that were no choices at all. So she scrubbed and carried and endured the cruelty, telling herself that survival was enough. The 5 men rode into Bitter Creek on a Tuesday afternoon, their horses muddy and their eyes harder than the mountains. They called themselves the Bridger Boys, though none bore that surname. Their leader, a scarred brute named Virgil Kane, had killed 3 men in disputes over cards and claimed he'd killed twice that many Indians for sport. His companions were cut from similar cloth. Drake, a former trapper with a taste for violence. The Jessup brothers, twin devils with identical sneers, and Rooster, a small man with quick hands and a quicker temper. They had money from robbing a supply wagon and meant to spend it on whiskey and worse. Martha was carrying a tray of dirty glasses when they first saw her. Virgil's laugh cut through the tavern noise like a knife. "Sweet Jesus, boys, look at the size of that sow." The room fell quiet. Every eye turned to Martha. Her face burned red as she tried to retreat to the kitchen, but Drake was already on his feet, blocking her path. "Where you going, piggy? Ain't you going to squeal for us?" The Jessup brothers made oinking sounds. Rooster slapped the table and howled. Even Cullen, the innkeeper, managed a nervous chuckle, unwilling to offend men with full purses and empty consciences. Martha fled to the kitchen, her eyes stinging. Behind her, the laughter continued. For 3 days, the Bridger boys remained in Bitter Creek, drinking away their stolen money and growing meaner with each bottle. They tormented Martha relentlessly. They tripped her, dumped food on her head, and made increasingly crude suggestions about what they'd like to do with a girl who probably had never felt a man's touch. The townspeople watched and said nothing. Fear was a powerful silence. On the 4th night, rain came down in sheets, turning the rutted main street into a river of mud. Martha had just finished cleaning the last table when Virgil grabbed her wrist. "Time for you to come have some fun with us, hog girl." She tried to pull away, but his grip was iron. Drake appeared on her other side, and suddenly she was being dragged toward the door. "Please," she begged, "please, I haven't done anything." "That's exactly the problem," Virgil growled. "Time someone taught you what you're good for." The few patrons remaining in the tavern looked away. Cullen studied his ledger with sudden intensity. Outside, the street was empty, the rain a curtain that hid all sins. They dragged Martha into the mud. She fell hard, her dress soaking instantly, her body too heavy and ungainly to rise quickly. One of the Jessup brothers kicked her in the ribs, not hard enough to break anything, but enough to make her cry out. "Load her in the wagon," Virgil ordered. "There's a nice quiet spot in the woods where we can—" "Touch her again, and I'll bury you where you stand." The voice came from the darkness beyond the stable, low and rough as stone grinding on stone. The Bridger boys turned, hands moving toward their pistols. A man stepped into the dim light spilling from the tavern windows. He was tall, dressed in buckskin and furs, with a broad-brimmed hat pulled low over eyes that reflected no warmth. A long rifle hung easy in his hands. A knife nearly as long as a man's forearm hung at his belt. His beard was dark and full, his face weathered by years of sun and wind and hardship. Elias Crow. The name came to Martha's mind, though she'd never seen him before. Everyone in the territory had heard whispers of the mountain man who lived in the high country, who came to civilization only twice a year to trade pelts and buy supplies. They said he'd been a soldier once, then a scout, then a mercenary for the highest bidder. They said he'd killed more men than smallpox. They said he'd lost his mind up in those mountains and now lived more like a wolf than a human being. "This ain't your business, mountain man," Virgil said, but his hand stayed near his gun. "Girl's fair game. Whole town knows it. I'm making it my business." Elias's voice never rose above a conversational level, but something in it made Martha's skin prickle. This was not a man who made idle threats. "There's 5 of us," Drake pointed out. "You might get 1, maybe 2 before we put you down." Elias smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing Martha had ever seen. "Then you better hope you're not one of the 2. Virgil's hand moved. He was fast, faster than most men. His pistol cleared leather and was coming up when Elias's rifle barked once. Virgil spun and fell, his gun flying into the mud, his shoulder blooming red. The Jessup brothers drew together. Drake and Rooster spread out, trying to flank the mountain man. What followed was not a gunfight like the exaggerated tales told in taverns. It was brutal and quick and efficient. Elias dropped his rifle and pulled 2 pistols in one smooth motion. The first shot took Drake in the chest. The second shattered one Jessup brother's knee. The third went wild as Rooster crashed into Elias from the side, knife flashing. They went down in the mud together, rolling and grappling. The remaining Jessup brother raised his gun, but Elias kicked out, catching him in the groin. The man folded with a wheeze. Rooster got his knife to Elias's throat, pressing down. The mountain man's hand shot up, catching Rooster's wrist, and there was a moment of straining silence broken only by the rain. Then Elias twisted violently, and something in Rooster's wrist snapped with a sound like a green branch breaking. The little man screamed. Elias threw him off, rolled to his feet, and kicked him in the head. Rooster went still. Virgil was trying to crawl away, leaving a trail of blood in the mud. The wounded Jessup brother whimpered and held his shattered knee. The other Jessup lay unconscious. Drake wasn't moving at all. Elias walked to Virgil, placed a boot on his wounded shoulder, and pressed down. Virgil screamed. "You ever come near this town again," Elias said quietly, "I will track you across this whole territory and feed you to the wolves one piece at a time. Understand?" Virgil nodded frantically, tears mixing with rain and mud on his face. Elias turned to Martha, who sat frozen in the mud where she'd fallen. She flinched when he approached, but his movements were slow and careful. He shrugged out of his bear hide coat and draped it over her shoulders. It was warm and smelled of pine smoke and leather. "Can you stand?" She nodded, but couldn't seem to make her legs work. Without asking, Elias bent and lifted her as if she weighed nothing, carrying her to where his horse stood patiently in the rain. He set her in the saddle, then mounted behind her. As they rode away from Bitter Creek, Martha looked back once. Faces appeared in windows, pale and watching, but no one came outside. No one said a word. The mountain trail was treacherous in the rain and darkness, but Elias's horse seemed to know the way by instinct. Martha drifted in and out of consciousness, exhausted and in shock, aware only of the warmth of the coat and the solid presence of the man behind her. She woke in a cabin. It was small, a single room with a stone fireplace at one end and a narrow cot at the other. Furs covered the floor. Dried herbs hung from the rafters. A fire crackled cheerfully, driving back the cold and dark. Martha sat up slowly, wrapped in blankets that smelled of cedar. Her dress had been hung near the fire to dry. She was wearing a shirt far too large for her, obviously borrowed. Elias sat at a rough-hewn table, cleaning his rifle with practiced efficiency. When he saw her stir, he stood and ladled something from a pot hanging over the fire. "Rabbit stew," he said, handing her a wooden bowl. "Eat." It was the best thing she'd ever tasted, or perhaps she was just starving. She ate 3 bowls before her body finally felt satisfied. "Thank you," she said when she could find her voice, "for everything." He nodded once, a brief acknowledgment, and returned to cleaning his weapons. "I should go back," Martha said, though the thought filled her with dread. "I have nowhere else." "You're not going back." It wasn't a suggestion or an offer. It was a statement of fact. "But I can't stay here. I won't be a burden to you." For the first time, Elias looked directly at her. His eyes were gray as winter sky and infinitely sad. "You'll stay until it's safe, however long that takes." They fell into an uneasy routine over the following days. The rain continued, trapping them in the cabin. Elias spoke little, but his actions were clear. He brought her food, kept the fire burning, and gave her space. He slept on furs near the door while she took the cot. He never touched her, never came too close, never made her feel unsafe. Slowly, Martha began to relax. She started helping with small tasks, mending his shirts with a needle and thread she found in a wooden box, tidying the cabin, preparing meals from the supplies he kept. Her hands knew the work of keeping a household, even one this humble. A week passed before she worked up the courage to ask the question that haunted her. It was evening, and they sat on opposite sides of the fire. Elias was carving something from a piece of wood, his hands surprisingly deft. Martha watched the firelight play across his scarred features. "Why did you help me?" she asked softly. "You don't know me. Everyone else in that town, they all knew what those men were going to do, and they did nothing. But you risked your life for a stranger. Why?" The knife stilled in Elias's hands. For a long moment he didn't answer. Then he set the carving aside and stared into the flames. "I had a wife once," he said, his voice rough with disuse and old pain. "Sarah. Met her in Missouri before I came west. She was small and fierce and afraid of nothing. Prettiest thing I'd ever seen." He paused, his jaw working. "I was young and stupid and thought I could build a life out here. We had a cabin, smaller than this one, down in a valley 20 miles south. I'd trap and hunt. She'd keep the home. We were happy." Martha waited, hardly breathing. "One winter, I went up into the high country for a week, chasing a rumor about beaver. When I came back," his voice cracked, "traders had come through. 3 men. They'd seen Sarah alone and they thought she was fair game, like you were fair game to those bastards in town." Martha's hand went to her mouth. "I found her in the snow," Elias continued, his voice now flat and dead. "She'd run from the cabin, got lost in the storm, froze to death because I wasn't there to protect her, because I chose beaver pelts over staying by her side." "That wasn't your fault," Martha whispered. "Wasn't it?" He looked at her then, and the anguish in his eyes was terrible to behold. "I tracked those men for 6 months, found them one by one, and I made sure they understood what they'd taken from me before I sent them to hell." He stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "After that I came up here. Couldn't stand being around people anymore. Couldn't stand myself. I thought if I just disappeared into these mountains, maybe the guilt would fade, but it never did." "Then why come down to Bitter Creek that night?" "I'd been watching the town for 2 days, working up the courage to trade my furs. Saw those bastards tormenting you. Told myself it wasn't my problem, that I'd done my heroics, and where had it gotten me?" He laughed bitterly. "But when I heard you scream, all I could see was Sarah, and I knew if I walked away, if I let them hurt you the way I let those men hurt her, I'd never be able to live with myself." Martha stood and crossed to him, moving slowly. He tensed, but didn't retreat. She reached out and took his hand in both of hers. "You saved my life," she said firmly. "Whatever guilt you carry from the past, you balanced the scales that night. You gave me a future. A future hiding in a mountain cabin with a broken man. A future where I'm not scrubbing floors for scraps and enduring cruelty every day. A future where I'm treated like a human being." She squeezed his hand. "That's more than I've had in years." Something shifted in Elias's face, not quite a smile, but a softening. He squeezed her hand back just once, then gently withdrew. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow I'll teach you to shoot." The mountain spring gave way to summer, and Martha bloomed like the wild flowers that covered the meadows. Elias proved to be a patient teacher. He showed her how to load and fire his rifle, how to track game through the forest, how to read the weather in the shape of clouds. She was clumsy at first, her body not suited to scrambling over rocks and through underbrush, but she was determined, and she learned. In turn, she civilized the cabin. She planted a small garden with seeds Elias had but never used. She organized his chaotic collection of tools and supplies. She cooked meals that were more than just meat roasted over a fire. She sang while she worked, old songs her mother had taught her, and gradually Elias began to hum along. They talked more as the weeks passed. He told her about his years as a soldier, fighting in battles that seemed meaningless now. She told him about her childhood, about parents who had loved her even when others mocked her size, about dreams she'd abandoned long ago. One evening in late July, As they sat watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson, Elias said something that made Martha's heart skip. "I'm glad you're here." 4 simple words, but from a man who spoke so rarely, they carried the weight of a sonnet. "I'm glad, too," she replied. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Martha saw something in his eyes she'd never seen directed at her before. Not pity, not disgust, not indifference, recognition, respect. Perhaps even the beginning of something deeper. But before either could speak, a sound drifted up from the valley below. Horses, many of them. Elias was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. "Get inside! Bar the door!" "What is it?" "Trouble." They came at dawn, and Martha understood immediately that this was the reckoning Elias had been expecting since the night he rescued her. There were 8 men, led by a 9th, who sat his horse with the arrogance of someone accustomed to command. Virgil Kane had healed from his shoulder wound, and he'd brought reinforcements. The Bridger boys had expanded their ranks. "Crow!" Virgil's voice echoed off the mountainside. "We've come for the girl. Send her out, and maybe we'll let you live." Martha peered through a crack in the shutters, her hands trembling. Elias stood in the doorway, his rifle cradled casually, though every line of his body radiated readiness. "You should have stayed gone, Virgil. You killed Drake. You crippled my boys. You think you can do that and just hide up here in your little love nest? I think you're about to find out just how badly you miscalculated." Virgil sneered. "There's 9 of us and 1 of you. Even you ain't that good, mountain man." "He's not alone." Martha stepped into the doorway beside Elias, holding the rifle he'd taught her to shoot. Her hands were steady now, her jaw set. Behind them, the cabin windows opened, and though it was just the 2 of them, she'd positioned additional rifles to give the appearance of more defenders. "The fat girl?" Virgil laughed. "What's she going to do, sit on us?" "She's going to put a bullet between your eyes if you don't turn around and ride away," Elias said calmly. "And before you doubt her ability, ask yourself, would I have let her stand here if she couldn't shoot?" Doubt flickered across Virgil's face. He'd seen Elias fight. He knew the mountain man didn't bluff. "Last chance," Elias said. "Right away. Don't come back, or I start killing, and I don't stop until all of you are feeding the crows." "Kill them!" Virgil screamed. The clearing erupted in gunfire. Elias's first shot took one of the new recruits out of his saddle. His second sent a horse rearing, throwing its rider. Martha fired at a man charging the cabin, and though her shot went wide, it was close enough to make him veer off. "Reload!" Elias barked, already swapping rifles. They'd practiced this. Martha dropped back inside, hands moving through the familiar motions of loading powder and shot. Outside, Elias fired with mechanical precision, each shot finding a target. But there were too many. 3 men rushed the door simultaneously. Elias dropped one with his pistol, clubbed another with his rifle, but the third got inside. Martha swung her rifle like a club, catching the man across the face. He stumbled, and she hit him again and again until he fell. She stood over him, breathing hard, amazed at her own ferocity. Elias glanced at her, something like pride in his eyes, then turned back to the fight. 2 men had gained the roof and were trying to shoot down through the wooden shingles. Elias grabbed a burning log from the fireplace and threw it at a puddle of oil Martha had spilled deliberately near the door. Flames roared up, driving the attackers back. "The back window!" Martha shouted. Elias spun, firing at a man climbing through. The shot caught him in the shoulder, and he fell back with a scream. The fight became a blur of smoke and noise and desperate violence. Martha fired until her rifle was empty, then grabbed a knife and stabbed a man who tried to drag Elias down. Together, they fought with the desperation of people who had everything to lose and nothing to go back to. When the smoke cleared, 5 men lay dead or dying in the clearing. 2 more were fleeing down the mountain trail. Virgil sat on his horse, clutching a wound in his side, his face white with pain and rage. "This isn't over," he gasped. Elias walked toward him, reloading his pistol as he moved. "Yes," he said quietly, "it is." He raised the gun, and Virgil's eyes went wide. "Wait, please, I'll go. I'll never come back. I swear." "You swore that before. I mean it this time. Just let me live." Elias stared at him for a long moment. Then he lowered the gun. "If I ever see you again," he said, "in any town, on any trail, anywhere in this territory, I will kill you on sight. No warning, no mercy. Do you understand?" Virgil nodded frantically. "Now get out of my sight." The wounded man kicked his horse into a stumbling gallop and disappeared down the mountain. Martha emerged from the cabin, her dress torn and bloody, her face smudged with powder smoke. She looked at the carnage, at the men they'd killed to survive, and felt nothing. No guilt, no horror, just a grim satisfaction that she was still alive. Elias turned to her, and she saw the same emptiness in his eyes. They'd both been pushed to their limits and discovered they were capable of terrible things when protecting what mattered. "Are you hurt?" he asked. She shook her head. "You?" "I'll live." They stood in the aftermath, 2 broken people who'd found in each other the strength to survive one more day. The summer faded into autumn, and the mountains burst into flame with red and gold. Elias and Martha rebuilt what had been damaged, buried the dead far from the cabin, and tried to return to the simple rhythms of mountain life. But something had changed between them. It started small, hands touching as they passed tools, eyes meeting across the fire and holding a moment longer than necessary, smiles that came easier and more often. One evening in September, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge, Elias spoke without looking at her. "I think I'm falling in love with you." Martha's breath caught. She turned to find him staring straight ahead, his jaw tight with tension. "I know I got no right," he continued. "I'm twice your age, got a past blacker than coal, and I live like a hermit in these God-forsaken mountains. But I needed you to know. You've brought light back into my life, and I love you for it." She reached over and took his hand, threading her fingers through his. "I love you too," she said simply. "You're the first person who ever saw me as something other than a burden or a joke. You taught me to be strong. You gave me a home. How could I not love you?" He turned to her then, and the vulnerability in his face nearly broke her heart. "You deserve better than this. Better than me." "I deserve to choose my own life," she said firmly, "and I choose this. I choose you, if you'll have me." His answer was to pull her close and kiss her with all the desperate tenderness of a man who thought he'd never feel anything again. They were married by a circuit preacher who came through in October, witnessed by 2 friendly trappers who traded with Elias. It was a simple ceremony, no flowers or fancy clothes, but when Martha spoke her vows, she meant every word. Winter came hard and cold, but they weathered it together. Spring brought new growth and the news, delivered by a trader, that Virgil Kane had been found dead in a saloon in Santa Fe, killed in a dispute over cards. The remaining Bridger boys had scattered to the winds. The threat was over. Martha stood in her garden one June morning, watching Elias repair the fence around their expanded cabin. He'd built a second room, preparing for the possibility of children, though neither spoke of it directly. She placed a hand on her belly, feeling the first subtle flutter of life within, and smiled. She thought about the girl she'd been 2 years ago, scrubbing floors in Bitter Creek, believing that endurance was the best she could hope for. That girl would never have imagined this, a husband who loved her, a home that was truly hers, a future bright with possibility. Elias looked up and caught her watching. He set down his hammer and walked over, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured. "How far we've come," she said. "How much we've survived." "We're survivors, you and I." "No," she corrected gently. "We're more than that. We're people who learn to live again." He kissed the top of her head, and they stood there in the sunlight, two souls who'd found each other in the darkest of places and built something beautiful from the ashes of their pain. The mountains rose around them, eternal and indifferent, but within their valley, Martha and Elias had carved out something the wilderness could never touch, a home, a love, and a future worth fighting for. And if sometimes strangers passed through and heard the story of the mountain man and the woman he'd saved, they were often surprised to learn which one of them was truly the stronger. For Martha had survived things that would have broken most people, and in the end, she'd saved Elias just as surely as he'd saved her. They'd given each other what neither could find alone, a reason to hope, a purpose beyond mere survival, and the profound understanding that sometimes the most unlikely people can forge the strongest bonds. The town of Bitter Creek faded into memory, a chapter closed. The mountains became their sanctuary, and in that wild, beautiful place, two wounded souls finally found peace.